develops our work in Southeast Asia. In his role, he has actually worked with government departments, lawyers, and civil society organizations in implementing activities that ranges from capacity building and also supporting development and environmental laws. For example, he has actually helped in drafting sections of the environmental code for an initiative in Cambodia. Prior to joining ELS, he was a attorney. He's actually a very experienced environmental attorney. He worked for the Eastern Environmental Law Center in New Jersey. In that role, he represented community groups in litigation and administrative proceedings on matters ranging from environmental justice, air pollution issues, water rights issues. And he also was a graduate of, he got his JD from the Rutgers School of Law in New York. And he also is an LLM grad. He got an LLM degree, magna cum laude from ELS in 2013. He also, in his role, he developed a course called the Environmental Governance in the Development World that's actually offered in the summer session, and this is his third year in teaching it. So today he'll be presenting on China's Belt and Road Initiative, what it is, and what does it mean for the environment. So, welcome.
All right. Thank you, CTIP and Courtney and the ELC for organizing this. So this is one of those things, I'm actually really happy to be giving this talk today because this is, I feel like, as CTIP mentioned, I spent most of my time over in Asia, previously a lot of time in China, but over the last few years mostly in Southeast Asia and between mostly Myanmar and Cambodia. And the Belt and Road is just one of those issues you cannot escape and cannot get away from. Everybody is talking about it, everybody's working on it, or everybody wants to be working on it. And it's sort of, elephant in the room probably isn't the right term for it because everybody's talking about it. It's not the thing that nobody's talking about. But so I'm really happy to try to give this talk today because it's one of those things that I feel like when I come home to the US, it's not talked about very often, nor is the scale of the BRI fully appreciated, I feel like sometimes, and so that's one of the things I sort of hope to get across today. So quickly, I assume, I just like to ask, who here has heard of the Belt and Road Initiative? You've probably seen news reports about it. Do you feel like you could describe what it is? Because after studying it, researching it, attending events, conferences, I still feel like I can't, it's sort of one of those things, it's like you try to explain it, but you kind of have to talk circles around it. So I looked, for that sort of one sentence succinct summary of what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is, and this is one of the favorite ones that I found. A loosely defined series of interconnected trade deals and infrastructure projects that seek to establish enhanced trade routes from China to Europe and Africa. The reason I chose this is because it's sort of, people often talk about the Belt and Road Initiative as if it's a packaged, sort of polished deal, but it's really more understood better as a broader policy strategy of the Chinese government that some enterprises investing abroad, try to use that as a label to heighten the stature of their projects, that type of thing. So there's not a sort of category or catalog of BRI projects. So that's one thing to remember. Next thing is, this is from an article off of Mongabay, but basically it's the largest infrastructure project or initiative that mankind has ever seen. Often in press you'll see comparisons between this and the Marshall Plan after World War II, but BRI just dwarfs it in every respect. So before we go any further, in case you wanted, if you were hoping for a cute little song to explain what the BRI is, you are in luck. We'll skip ahead. I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing. So this is part of China's like slick new sort of public PR campaign about the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'll talk about in a minute about how it was almost like a blitzkrieg of investment that they started out with. And over the first few years, they experienced some roadblocks and stumbles and whatnot. And they're sort of, at the process now of recalibrating. But this video, I think, came out 2 or 3 years ago and was sort of, and I purposefully chose the most cringeworthy part of the video. But there's a couple other ones that are equally as bad. So what is it? What are we talking about? It really started out in 2013. President Xi Jinping, in a pair of speeches given in Kazakhstan and in Indonesia, is the first sort of reference to the Belt and Road. In Kazakhstan, he mentioned the need for a new Silk Road economic belt. And in Indonesia, he mentioned the need for a new maritime Silk Road, which is, to make things even more confusing than they already are, refers to the maritime route. So it's not actually a road, it's shipping passengers and things like that. And obviously it's inspired by ancient Silk Road trade routes. It's meant to sort of conjure the images of the old trade routes that spanned across Central Asia. And it's a series of projects that include, these are very large, generally very large infrastructure projects. We're talking about railways, bridges, deep sea ports, large special economic zones, telecommunications. They're building what's called the Digital Silk Road. So China, if anyone's read about China's sort of methods for control of its internet and things like that, they're actually exporting some of that technology to other countries. So the basic takeaway is this thing is huge. And this is sort of there's a whole host of kind of policy documents that various entities within the Chinese government has issued. This is from one of the first ones that was issued by the National Development and Reform Commission, which is a very powerful sort of economic planning body in China, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce. And I'm not going to read through that whole thing, but there's a lot of very nice flowery language about economic integration and increasing trade and investment opportunities. And the last line, which I like, is that it will inject new positive energy into world peace and development. So, what exactly is it? This is a map of the 6 main corridors of the Belt and Road Initiative, including the maritime route, which you can see with the blue dotted line. So as I mentioned, there's a series, they're building a series of large infrastructure projects to effectuate these corridors. And so for example, the China-Pakistan corridor in the middle there, they've built a railway from China's western regions, Xinjiang, down to the Gwadar port, which is a deep sea port that was built essentially out of nothing by China. And they also financed the railway. And that cut down the shipping of goods from something like 3 weeks from the east coast of China to Pakistan to about 36 hours because they could just put it on rail. So there's a railway from London all the way to Yiwu in China, which obviously cuts travel time as well. And then along the blue dotted line, you can see actually you can't on this map, but where the dots reach the land is where China's building ports, deep sea ports, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. So by the numbers, over 70 countries have either signed on to BRI projects or signaled their intention to do so. These countries account for over 40% of global GDP, 60% of the world's population, 75% of known energy reserves. And China claims to have signed agreements with 126 countries in total. And the reason I put agreements in quotes is because those agreements may be simple MOUs to explore future projects, that type of thing. But I still think that number is significant because it shows that countries are more and more signing on to this initiative. And just some more numbers. These numbers are as of April 2019, and they come directly from China Daily, which is a state-owned publication. But up to $600 billion in total value of new contracts signed with BRI countries. $90 trillion of is the total value of Chinese companies' investment in BRI countries. Which when I first read, I had to double check it because I was like, that doesn't, 90 trillion just sounds like one of those made up numbers. So estimates predict that this will all exceed $1.3 trillion by 2027. So we're talking about just a phenomenally huge amount of money. And these are just some more sort of visualizations of what the BRI actually looks like. And I apologize, this didn't come out as clearly as I had hoped. But the graph on the left shows the progression of newly contracted BRI projects. As of 2017, there were 7,007 total projects. And I think the way to read that is 143 billion for the calendar year 2017. On the right is the types of projects that are being invested in. The biggest chunk up on the upper right here is hydropower, 22%. They're also investing significantly in coal under the BRI, so it's about 12%. And then rail infrastructure is the next largest one at the bottom at 19%. And where is all this money coming from? This shows on the left, the pie chart, so back up a minute. Most of the money financing coming for these projects comes from state-owned banks or policy banks in China. So 50% comes from the big four state-owned banks, which are like Bank of China, China Construction Bank. 40% comes from the China Development Bank, which is China's sort of, you could think of it as an equivalent of sorts of the Asian Development Bank. It's a bank more focused on promoting development. But one statistic that I found quite shocking is that the CDB's annual budget is around $40 to $45 billion, which is around $10 billion higher than World Bank, ADB, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank combined. And I want you to remember that number, 40 to 45 billion, for what I'm going to get to in a minute, which is the U.S. response to some of this. But before I do that, I wanted to take a pause just to lay out the context a little bit. So trivia question, does anybody know who this guy is? Except for Alexander. Yeah. I figured you guys would know. This is Deng Xiaoping. So he was famous. So Deng Xiaoping was the leader who took over and after Chairman Mao died and started China's market opening and reforms. And he famously, one of his strategies at the time, he famously said, hide your strengths and bide your time. Which is fitting coming from Deng Xiaoping, because he has a particularly interesting story, because this photograph is when he was young in Yan'an, China, camping out with the communists as they were fighting the nationalists. And this was right after the Long March, which is one of the most phenomenal sort of military feats in history. And even though he was part of the Long March, part of that original cadre of communists, during Cultural Revolution, he was shipped off to some shoe factory in Sichuan province somewhere and had to sort of suffer through that for about 10 years as a bunch of Mao's other really close associates ended up getting killed and tortured and so on. So it's particularly fitting coming from him. But back to the issue at hand, the Belt and Road Initiative on a sort of broader geopolitical level has been seen as, some see it as a counterbalance to President Obama's pivot to Asia. I don't know if anybody recalls Obama's sort of foreign policy. He was pursuing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Belt and Road Initiative was sort of seen as a way to counter that influence. There's also, very interestingly, the contrast between America's century, which is what the 20th century is sometimes referred to as, versus China's century of humiliation. And I think this is a point that's really worth remembering when considering all of this stuff, because China does, it's a very proud country with a very long history and very complex culture and language and art and literature. But during the mid-1800s until the Communist Party took over in 1949, it suffered a series of humiliations, what they would call humiliations, from the Opium Wars to the Boxer Rebellion, to its treatment after World War I, even though it supplied a lot of the labor and soldiers during World War I. So to put this BRI in context, this is sort of, it can almost be seen as President Xi Jinping's way to, come out from this century of humiliation. So I had a video. I'm going to skip it, though, because running out of time. In the video was a quote from Václav Havel, who was speaking about China, saying, everything in China is happening so quickly, we haven't had time to be astonished yet. So I wanted to illustrate that, show this map of China's high-speed rail network. How much high-speed rail do we have in the States? 0, right. This is from China's first high-speed rail went into operation in 2007. From 2007 to 2019 to today, they've built over 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, which I find is just phenomenal. I used to ride New Jersey Transit all the time, commuting to work in Newark, and it's just the contrast between riding the New Jersey Transit and one of these high-speed trains is a little depressing sometimes. So just want to illustrate how capable they are of building these large infrastructure projects. Prior to BRI, China had implemented its going out strategy, which started in sort of the early 2000s, which begun to promote Chinese companies going out and investing either through foreign direct investment or as contractors in other countries. And as you can see, it really started to take off around 2004, 2005, and then 2015, with the announcement of the Belt and Road, really took off after that. And there's been a slight dip since 2017, I think mainly because of China's experiencing a little bit of economic downturn, and as I'll get to in a minute, there's been a bit of a backlash against BRI projects. So they've actually had a bunch of projects canceled. So real quick, I'll try to go through this. Actually, I have more time than I thought. So just to provide an illustration, I wanted to pick out a project at random. Essentially, I didn't pick this one for any particular reason other than it illustrates some of the points of concern that have been raised with regards to BRI projects, which we will get to, but mainly they deal with the risk that Chinese financing, given its opacity, is imposing impossible debt burdens on countries that it's lending money to for these projects. And the second big one is environmental and social impacts, concerns associated with those. So this is a railway that was built in Kenya, and I don't actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think it's a high-speed railway. I think it's just a standard railway. But it's the biggest and largest infrastructure project in Kenya since Kenya gained independence. It's a 293-mile line from Mombasa, where China built a deep-sea port in Mombasa, to Nairobi. The total price tag was around $3.6 billion US dollars, which was financed mainly through $3.2 billion loan from the China Exim Bank. It was built by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. It was launched 18 months ahead of schedule, and has significantly cut passenger and cargo travel time from the port to Nairobi. But looking at it as part of a larger trend in Kenya, you can see what are some of the concerns raised with regards to debt traps and debt risk. So this is a table of China's share of Kenya's debt burden. And it's a little janky because formatting difficulties. But you can see it's a little small, but in 2013, China's share of Kenya's bilateral debt was only 24%. And then after the announcement of the BRI initiative, that ballooned to 72%. And this is a trend, you know, again, I picked out Kenya, but this is a trend that you see in a lot of countries in which China is investing for these BRI projects. And in a lot of these countries, like Laos, for example, China is also building a high-speed rail in Laos, and there's a lot of discussion over whether Laos is going to be able to handle that debt burden, and if not, what will the consequences be? Sri Lanka recently had to actually hand over control of a port that China built because it couldn't actually pay back the loan, so it handed back control of the port as collateral. So a lot of concerns are being raised about whether this debt burden is sustainable for these countries. As far as environmental issues for the rail line, this is a map that was put together by National Geographic, but the rail line itself crosses two national parks, one of which is the famous Nairobi National Park, which is right outside of, or sort of borders Nairobi. The local NGOs did attempt to use the court system to halt the construction of the first phase of the project. That was denied, and the first phase got constructed, and then they actually brought a suit to halt the second portion, which goes through Nairobi National Park, and did obtain a court order for construction to be halted, but apparently the government and the company just simply went ahead with construction anyway, ignoring the court order, which raises issues that, again, we'll get to in a minute about a lot of China's policies to address these environmental impacts and overseas investment generally direct companies to follow the local laws and regulations of the host countries. But if you have a situation where you have a court order saying you can't go forward with construction, but you have a government agency saying, yeah, let's go ahead with construction, like what is following the local law and regulation in an instance like that? So the other thing I found interesting with this case was that actually 7 routes in total were considered for this route, 2 of which were outside the national park, but these were shelved because the route within the park was found to be the most economically feasible. And these are, by the way, heavy migration routes for large mammals like elephants, giraffes, things like that. So it's a very ecologically sensitive area, which is another theme with BRI. A lot of these projects are being implemented in places that are either former or recently former conflict zones, and just other areas that have been traditionally difficult to reach and as such are very ecologically sensitive. So there's that. So some of the other environmental concerns that have been raised, the Asia Society Policy Institute actually just within the last week or so put out a good study or policy document. This document focused mainly on Southeast Asia, but these are concerns that we've seen raised sort of across the board, which is that, similar to what I just brought up with the Kenya example, is that Chinese developers routinely avoid environmental and social impact assessment obligations, compensation for land takings, resettlement requirements. And part of the reason for this is, at least with regards to things like compensation and resettlement, is that for a lot of these companies, when they're operating within China, the Chinese government takes the lead on a lot of those issues. But once they get outside of China to a place like Cambodia, and all of a sudden they're, like, the company itself is in charge of organizing the resettlement plans, the compensation, they literally, have no experience doing so. So that creates a big problem. And again, they often will cite, if someone raises an issue saying, say in Cambodia, for example, oh, your project has gone ahead without an EIA, which is required by law, they'll sort of lean back and say, hey, it was another ministry in Cambodia made this decision and we're not going to interfere in their internal affairs. So I don't know, is that following the law? I'm not really sure. On a broader level, so that was sort of, those are the main project-specific concerns. And then on a broader level, with regards to the overall strategy behind BRI, one of the big concerns that's been raised with regards to the environment is the BRI's investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. So 91% of their energy sector loans to BRI countries went to fossil fuel sector. China is funding up to 25% of all coal-fired power plants that are being constructed outside of China. And BRI countries currently account for about a quarter of global GHG emissions, but most of the BRI countries are developing countries with very low electrification rates and very low access to electricity, and some of them, like Vietnam, for example, are actually contemplating increasing their share of coal-fired energy generation to fill that gap. So these emissions from BRI countries could rise to 50% by 2050 under the worst case scenario. Apart from the environmental concerns, there's the geopolitical concerns that have been raised. China generally touts the Belt and Road Initiative as a simple sort of way to further integrate the world economically, provide, you saw the kids singing about it, provide opportunities for cultural exchange, things like that. Trade opportunities, but there's also been some concerns raised on a geopolitical sense about what are China's actual larger ambitions for all of these projects, many of which have questionable financial value. So there has been put forth the string of pearls theory, which generally refers to this string of, and I apologize again, this didn't come out as clear as I wanted it to, but this sort of string of red dots, these are all ports that China is constructing. And I also want to be clear that when I say something like that, China is constructing, that means that a Chinese state-owned enterprise is constructing the port. It's likely funded by a state-owned bank, and so effectively is a government project. But they're, all the way from Haikou up here. This is the Spratly Islands, which I'm sure you've seen in the news. There's been a lot of controversy over China's building of artificial reefs, basically, on these like little rocks out in the middle of the ocean. This is in Cambodia, and this article references, a few years ago, our program did a project where we did some case studies on Chinese investment projects in the region. One of the projects we visited was a tourism development in Koh Kong province in Cambodia. And if anyone's been to Cambodia, Koh Kong is like way the hell out there, sort of north of Sihanoukville. I mean, there's nothing there right now. And we went out and did a site visit of this enormous tourism development project that was like thousands of acres. It was enormous, and there was a lot of stories in the news about people being violently evicted from their homes and having their homes burnt down. And they were all generally fishermen who lived on the shore, and they were resettled like 20, 30 kilometers inland where they had no access to the sea anymore, all for these like sprawling golf courses, like timeshare type houses, Olympic-sized pools. And we went and did a site visit, and it was beautiful, whatever. It looked nice, but there was nobody there. It was like the weirdest thing. And then a year later, we saw photos of the place and the facility, like the hotel facility is all in ruins now. It just hasn't been kept up because they couldn't actually get any Chinese tourists to go there. And so one of the elements of the project was a deep sea port. They were going to build an airport, a deep sea port, the hotel sector, the timeshare sectors. But speculation arose that the deep sea port was actually a front for a docking station for Chinese naval vessels. So that's, behind all of this, there's all these geopolitical concerns, which I think is a point I want to raise and emphasize, because when we're talking about investment, China-related investment, we're talking about a very different thing than U.S. companies, for example, going and deciding whether or not to invest in an infrastructure project in a given country, because a U.S. company is going to go in there and just determine whether or not this is going to make me any money, and if not, I'm not going to do it. But China does have these sort of broader geopolitical ambitions and goals. So it's a very, 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 very different calculus. So earlier I referenced that the BRI initiative has experienced some kind of roadblocks and obstacles and stumbles. So the honeymoon phase is over, essentially. The Chinese government has become aware of this, and they are, like I mentioned, trying to calibrate their approach, come up with new guidelines and policies for overseas companies investing overseas, come up with new sort of metrics and monitoring and verifying systems for companies that are investing overseas. I also mentioned earlier that several countries have actually recently canceled or significantly scaled down BRI projects, specifically because of the concerns related to the opacity of the terms of the agreement or environmental concerns. And just to pick an example, in Myanmar, China was going to develop the Jiaopyu Special Economic Zone, which ultimately connects with an oil and gas pipeline that goes directly to Kunming in Yunnan province. And so they also want to build a high-speed rail from Kunming down to Jiaopyu, so they have a direct kind of line to the Indian Ocean without having to go around Southeast Asia. Originally, that project was going to be something crazy like $7.5 billion, but that was negotiated under the former government in Myanmar. They had elections. The new government was, seeing what was happening around the world, and they decided to renegotiate and got it down to about 1.3 billion. So that's a very significant reduction. But it's just an example to show that countries are starting to take this seriously and are starting to push back. There is a just litany of policy documents that the Chinese government has issued addressing various aspects of Chinese overseas investment, and it's kind of next to impossible to keep track of all of them. But this is just a sort of a illustrative list. And one thing to note about this list is that these policy documents are coming from very diverse entities. So the first one is the State Council, which is the most powerful administrative sort of entity in China and consists of the senior members of the Politburo who make all the big decisions. You have the second one, which is Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and SASAC, which is the State Assets Supervisory, help me out, State Assets, I don't know, something. Yeah, something like that. But essentially, SASAC is the entity that controls all the state-owned enterprises in China. So they have a very high degree of influence because most of the BRI-related investment is done by state-owned enterprises. You also have, going down a little bit, CBRC, that's the China Banking Regulatory Commission. They regulate all of the state-owned and policy banks in China. You have CHINCA, which is the China International something Contractors Association. I forgot that one too. But they are a contractors association. They're not necessarily a government body, but they operate under the auspices of the Ministry of Commerce. So it's a little gray area there. And then you have policies issued by the development banks. China Development Bank, China Exim Bank has its own policies. And also going down to the bottom of the list, you have company-specific policies as well. So there's no shortage of policies that have been developed and issued. It's just a question of what's done with them. And this is, I'm just going to go through these real quick. If you're interested to learn more, or actually, if you're interested to like really nerd out and look at the actual documents themselves, the International Institute for Sustainable Development put out a very good compilation, and this compilation is only up to date up to 2013. But I just wanted to, this is just the table of contents of the report, and each of these lines is a separate policy or guideline or whatever they call it. But just to give you an appreciation of sort of the vast array of measures and guidelines that have been issued. Like I said, the Chinese government has recognized a lot of the problems that they've encountered with regards to its initial rollout of the Belt and Road Initiative. And in April of this year, China held the second Belt and Road Forum, International Belt and Road Forum. And there was a lot of coverage about how President Xi Jinping in his keynote address at least paid a lot of lip service to saying that the Belt and Road Initiative must be green and sustainable and so on and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see how that all actually plays out. Another just interesting thing to note with regards to the Belt and Road Forum is that China was able to get 37 heads of state to come and attend this forum, and a number of very high dignitaries from like 130 other countries. So this is a huge event. And notably, given the sort of troubled current state of U.S.-China relations, the U.S. didn't send anybody to the Belt and Road Forum. There was a guy, Mike Pottinger, who was held some position in the State Department, who was sent as the U.S. representative to the first Belt and Road Forum, but they didn't even send him to the second one. So a little bit of tension there. This one I'm just going to skip real quick. So how has the U.S. responded? I know we're running out of time, but I just want to do this one real quick. The U.S. is, I think, getting a little jittery about all of this.
I know that the United States offers a better option. We don't drown our partners in sea of debt. We don't coerce or compromise your independence. The United States deals openly and fairly. We do not offer a constricting belt or a one-way road. When you partner with us, we partner with you, and we all prosper.
So that was Mike Pence's take. Secretary of State Pompeo has been making similar sort of statements publicly, which I kind of find that a little ironic, because when BRI was sort of first starting to come out, one of the things you heard was that developing countries liked BRI contracts specifically because they didn't come with the strings attached that the U.S. and other development partners usually have. Like, they need to promote governance in their countries, or do some sort of like democracy-related activities. So it's sort of funny. In 2018, President Trump signed the BUILD Act, which was seen as the U.S.'s sort of initial counter action with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. And these are just some excerpts from the initial policy statement of the BUILD Act. The one on the bottom, I thought, was the most significant in that it basically directly calls out China in the language of the statute itself, which I thought was kind of interesting. And the BUILD Act establishes what's called the United States International Development Finance Corporation, which is essentially a combination of the former Overseas Private Investment Corporation and the USAID's Development Credit Authority. Does anybody remember the China Development Bank, what their annual budget is from earlier in the presentation? 40 to 45 billion annually. So this US IDFC, their pot of money is $60 billion in total. So I think we have a long way to go to compete with that. So finally, what are NGOs and INGOs doing? They're like I said, in Southeast Asia and the Mekong region, you can't get away from this issue. A lot of organizations are working on it and are doing a wonderful job. I picked out a few here to highlight, not necessarily for any specific reason, but just to sort of show what some organizations are doing. There's an organization called Inclusive Development International, which has put together a very, very good and very thorough reference guide for advocates on Chinese Belt and Road issues. So they have a very good compilation of all the relevant policies and sort of how to use them in advocating before Chinese companies. Friends of the Earth did a very good assessment of China's green credit guidelines and the implementation of those guidelines. WWF has also done a lot of great work on the finance side of BRI issues. And then Global Environmental Institute is actually a Chinese NGO that we've worked with closely in the past. And if you're interested to learn more, I would encourage you to just Google Global Environmental Institute or any of these. They have several good reports analyzing a lot of these issues. But with regards to China's policies, the main takeaway that I sort of didn't mention with those is they all tend to be voluntary and non-enforceable. So that's the one sort of major, at least from a lawyer's perspective, the one major kind of like roadblock that a lot of advocacy organizations are trying to strategize about. Because I don't know, for me, it's sort of like whenever anybody starts talking about financing and green credit and blah, 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 I'm sort of like, call me back when you want to sue somebody. But that's, people have explored whether China could adopt legislation domestically that would allow people to sue Chinese companies in Chinese courts for actions that Chinese companies took abroad, in sort of informal conversations that seem like a non-starter, but we'll see. There are some interesting cases going on right now of similar things happening. For example, there's a case going on right now where a group of Cambodian villagers are suing a Thai sugar company in Thai courts for actions that company took in Cambodia. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that and whether something like that could serve as a precedent for China. We've done some research in our program about the Alien Tort Statute in the US. The jurisprudence with that is kind of all over the place right now. Finally, the Supreme Court did issue a decision recently concluding that the International Finance Corporation is not immune to suit in US courts, which is a very interesting decision. So that's another one to watch and see what happens with that, because it's sent back to the trial phase now. So, and this had to do with a coal plant in India. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with initiatives like that, and to see whether those types of things could serve as a model for China to follow. So I've gone well over my time limit, so I'm going to cut it off there. Yeah, any questions?
We have time for one question.
Yeah.
A cardinal feature of U.S. foreign investment, promoting foreign investment, has been the establishment of a whole series of investor protection agreements between the United States and companies that are the object of U.S. foreign investment interest, in order to provide greater security for the U.S. investors and allow them to bring, if the host country, after getting a loan for $500 billion, decides to adopt domestic policies that frustrate the investment, allow the U.S. investor to bring fair and equitable treatment claims or expropriation claims
Right.
through an arbitration process headquartered in Geneva or somewhere, not in the host country courts, not in the U.S. courts.
Right.
I'm just curious how the Chinese have approached the question of dispute resolution over foreign investments.
Yeah, that's a good question. Specifically with regards to bilateral investment treaties, I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't looked into that really. But China has established what they're calling, I don't know the official name, but it's like a Belt and Road Court, which is headquartered in China. And I know it's supposed to handle commercial disputes regarding Belt and Road investments, but it's very new, and there has been some research done on exactly what that court's going to look like and how it's going to function. But I think they've only handled like one case so far. So in terms of how it plays out, we were sort of looking at it a little bit from the angle of whether impacted communities would be able to use that court as an avenue for grievance redress. So that's sort of the angle we were looking at it from. But I think that would probably be the thing to watch, and to see how those types of disputes, I don't know. I don't know how that court's going to work, or how someone would bring a claim, how a Chinese company would bring a claim in a court in China against an action that a host country. There's just sort of a lot of mental gymnastics.
You set up a judicial system of that type, but you would think the host countries would be reluctant
I mean, on top of that, given the shady circumstances under which a lot of these deals are made, I'm not sure anybody's really thinking about that.